My brother's retirement party was on a Saturday in October, and my mother called me 4 days before to let me know they'd moved it to a larger venue. She said it like it was good news. She said, "Isn't that wonderful?" The response was so much better than expected. And I said, "Yes, that's great." And she said she had to go because she was helping coordinate the catering, and that was the whole conversation. No mention of whether I still had a seat. No mention of whether my name was still on the list. I assumed it was. I am his sister. I've always assumed things like this, and I've always been wrong, and I have never learned. My brother spent 22 years in the Canadian Forces. He started as a signals operator out of CFB Borden and worked his way up to a posting in Ottawa. And when he retired as a warrant officer last fall, my parents treated it the way some families treat a moon landing. Which is fine. It is something. I don't say that without meaning it. 22 years is a long time to give to anything. But I want to tell you what my childhood looked like, because otherwise, none of what happened at that party will make sense. My brother is 6 years older than me. When he joined the forces at 19, I was 13, and I watched my parents drive him to the base with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for departures that don't come back. My mother cried. My father shook his hand. There were photos. I stood on the porch in my socks because no one had told me to get my shoes. That was not a metaphor. That actually happened. For the next 2 decades, my brother was the subject of every dinner table conversation, every Christmas card update, every phone call my parents made to relatives I barely knew. He was promoted. He was posted overseas. He came home, and my mother made his favorite meal, and my father sat straighter in his chair. I finished high school. I got a scholarship to study accounting at the University of Guelph. I graduated with distinction. I passed my CPA exams on the first attempt, which fewer than half of candidates do. My mother told her book club that I worked in finance. I moved to Toronto after I qualified. I built a practice from almost nothing, mostly small businesses, a few contractors, eventually a handful of mid-sized firms. I'm not wealthy in any flashy sense, but I own my apartment outright, I have no debt, and last spring I was appointed as a part-time instructor at a college in the city. I find the work genuinely satisfying. I am good at it. My parents have never asked what I do, specifically. My father once asked if I did taxes, and when I said it was more complex than that, he nodded the way people nod when they're waiting for you to stop talking. So when my mother called about the party and didn't mention my seat, I didn't push. I told myself it was an oversight. I told myself there was no version of this where my parents simply didn't account for me at my own brother's retirement party. I drove the 4 hours from Toronto to Barrie on Saturday morning, and I wore the dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Dark green, the kind of thing I'd normally talk myself out of. And I stopped at a bakery in town and picked up a card and a gift card for the outdoor equipment store my brother loves. And I drove to the venue feeling, if I'm honest, cautiously hopeful. The venue was a Legion Hall that had been recently renovated. New floors, a bar along one side, round tables with white linens and little centerpieces made of Canadian wildflowers. It looked genuinely nice. Someone had put real effort into it. My parents were near the entrance when I arrived, talking to a couple I didn't recognize, and my mother saw me and said, "Oh, you made it," in the tone of voice you use for someone who was never quite expected. My father turned, glanced at me, turned back. My brother was across the room with his wife and I waved, and he gave me a half wave back, the kind with just the fingers, not the whole hand. I went to find my place card. I walked the perimeter of the room twice. There were 10 tables. My name was not on any of them. I stood near the bar and tried to think about what to do. I wasn't going to make a scene. I am 31 years old, and I have sat with worse feelings than this in worse situations, and I know how to keep my face doing the right thing while my chest does something else entirely. I found a server and asked quietly if there was a seating list I could check. She went and looked and came back and said my name wasn't on the master list at all. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. She was probably 22. I said, "That's okay, don't worry about it, because I always say things like that to people who don't deserve the weight of the situation I'm standing in." I found a chair at the end of a table near the side exit, next to a folded stack of extra programs and a power bar that someone had run along the baseboard. The table had 7 seats, and I was the only one at it for the first hour. People would drop their jackets there occasionally and then migrate toward the center tables where the families were clustered. No one sat next to me. A few people smiled at me the way you smile at someone you feel mildly sorry for. My brother gave a speech. It was good, actually. He's always been a composed speaker. measured and dry in a way that works in rooms like this. He thanked my parents at length. He thanked his wife. He thanked his commanding officers by name. He did not mention me. I don't think it was intentional. I think I simply didn't occur to him. My mother got up after and said a few words, and she talked about the values they tried to instill in their son, and the pride they felt, and how hard it is to raise a child who goes off into the world and does something that matters. I watched my father nod along, his face open and full in a way I had not often seen it. I ate the dinner that was served because I'd driven 4 hours and I was hungry. The person who sat down next to me, eventually, about an hour and a half into the reception, was a man who introduced himself as Terrence. He told me he was a retired civil servant, used to work out of the Ministry of Finance in Queen's Park, and that he'd served briefly with my brother at a joint project years ago and had come down from Sudbury for the occasion. He was in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of deliberate manner of someone who had spent a career reading rooms. He asked me how I knew the guest of honor. I said, "He's my brother." Terrence looked at me for a moment and then looked around the room in a way that was brief but thorough, the way someone looks when they're updating a map they thought they already knew. He said, "I didn't see you mentioned in the speeches." I said, "No." He asked what I did. I told him, CPA, private practice, some teaching. He said he knew the firm I'd done some work for 2 years ago, a mid-sized logistics company in Mississauga, because his son-in-law had been on their board during that period. He asked a few questions that were specific and informed, and I answered them. And we had a conversation that was the most professionally substantive one I had had in months, that didn't involve a client file. At some point, my father came over to refill his drink at the small table near ours, and Terrence looked up and said, in the easy tone of someone making normal conversation, "Your daughter was just telling me about the restructuring work she led last year. That's not a small thing to pull off." My father looked at me. He looked at Terrence. He said, "Sorry?" Terrence said, "The Carmichael Group file. I heard about it through my son-in-law. They were watching that situation closely." She turned it around. "Apparently, it's become something of a case study in how you approach that kind of insolvency risk." My father said, "I didn't know about that. Not, I'm proud of her. Not, she never mentioned it. Just, I didn't know about that." Like a fact he was filing away. Like a discrepancy in a ledger. My mother had drifted over by this point, drawn by some instinct for any conversation involving my father in a social setting. She was holding a glass of sparkling water and smiling at Terrence in the reflexive way she smiled at anyone she didn't know. Terrence said, "You must be proud. It takes a particular kind of discipline to build a practice like that independently, especially getting into instruction as well." My mother's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. There is a specific quality to my mother's silence. I have known it my whole life, where her face stays pleasant and her eyes go somewhere else, somewhere interior. Somewhere she's running a calculation she won't share out loud. She said, "Yes, of course." Terrence nodded and excused himself to get a drink. And then it was just me and my parents, which had not happened in a room like this in years. My father was looking at me with an expression I didn't quite have a name for. Not guilt, exactly. More like the look you get when you find a receipt for something you forgot you bought. My mother said, "You should have told us." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about every time I had sent an email that went unanswered for weeks. I thought about the phone calls that ended in 5 minutes because there was something on television. I thought about the scholarship, the exam results, the promotion I got 3 years ago that I mentioned at Christmas dinner, and that was met with a brief pause before my father asked my brother if he wanted more potatoes. I said, "I did tell you. You just didn't hear it." She didn't respond to that. My father looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back up and said with a kind of effortful casualness, "Well, you're doing well then." I said, "Yes, I am." He nodded. They both drifted back toward the center tables, toward the light and the noise and the version of the evening they planned. I stayed at my table near the side exit. I finished my wine. I watched my brother laugh at something across the room, his wife's hand on his arm, my parents nearby, and glowing. He is a good person, my brother. I believe that. I think the machinery of our family simply ran in one direction for so long that no one thought to check whether there were other parts of the house. Terrence came back with his drink and sat down again and asked if I wanted another glass of anything. And I said no, I had a drive ahead. And he said, "Where to?" And I said, "Toronto." And he said he used to live near Roncesvalles in the 90s, and it had changed enormously since then. And we talked about that for a while, about the city, about what stays and what doesn't. When I left, I said goodbye to my brother and his wife. She hugged me the way she always has, properly, with both arms, and said she was glad I came, and I believed her. He said drive safe. My parents were talking to someone near the bar. I caught my mother's eye on the way to the door, and she gave me a nod that was hard to read. I drove back on the 400, and the highway was quiet and dark, and the trees on either side had mostly turned. That deep October mix of red and yellow that always looks more dramatic at night. I didn't call anyone. I didn't need to. There is a version of this story where I feel sorry for myself, and I've lived in that version for a long time. What I've been trying to do lately is live in a different one. A version where my value isn't determined by whether my parents remembered to put my name on a seating list. A version where 22 years of work building something real doesn't become less real because it happened in a room no one at that party was looking at. I turned off the highway at my exit. I parallel parked in front of my building on the first try, which I always find satisfying, the small domestic competence of it. I let myself in. I fed my cat. I made tea. The next morning, I sat down at my desk, and I did the thing I always do when a week has taken something from me. I worked. I pulled up a file I've been putting off, something complicated with a lot of moving parts, and I sat with it for 3 hours until it started to make sense, until the pieces went where they were supposed to go. That is something I know how to do. It is something no one gave me and no one can take back. My mother texted me 2 days later. It said, "We should have a proper visit sometime, maybe at Christmas." I read it twice. I thought about what it would mean to say yes, what version of myself I'd have to bring through that door, whether it was the same one who drove home alone on a Saturday in October with the radio off because silence was what the drive needed. I wrote back, "That will be nice. Let me know dates." And then I put my phone down and got back to work, and that felt, more than almost anything else I'd done that week, like the truest thing. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs to keep your mouth shut in rooms where you should have spoken. Not the dramatic kind of silence. Not the silence of someone who is strategic or zen or above it all. The other kind. The kind that comes from years of learning. Very early. That your voice doesn't land the way other people's do in the same room. That you can say a thing clearly and watch it pass through the air and dissolve before it reaches anyone. I spent a long time thinking that was a flaw in how I spoke. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand it was about who was listening. What happened at that Legion Hall in Barrie didn't change anything, not really. Terrence didn't swoop in and fix my family. My father said, "I didn't know about that." And my mother said, "You should have told us." And then they went back to the center tables, and nothing was resolved, and nothing was repaired. That's not the part I keep returning to. The part I keep returning to, the part I keep returning to is what I did afterward. I drove home. I fed my cat. I sat down the next morning and worked through a complicated file until it made sense. And somewhere in those hours, I understood something I hadn't been able to articulate before, that I had built something real, and I had built it honestly, and it did not require their acknowledgement to exist. That's the thing about integrity, the actual, unglamorous version of it, not the word you put on a resume. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly in the background while you're doing the work no one is watching. Every exam I sat, every client I called back on a Friday evening, every time I chose the harder, slower, more correct path when the easier one was right there. None of that was visible at that party. It was never meant to be visible. It was just the life I was building, one careful decision at a time, because I didn't know any other way to do it. And the intelligence I'm most grateful for now isn't the kind that passed exams. It's the kind that eventually let me see my own situation clearly, without flinching and without drama. To understand that being unseen by the people who are supposed to see you first is genuinely painful, and also that it is not a verdict. Those are two things that can both be true. It took me a long time to hold them at the same time without one canceling the other out. The persistence is the part I'm proudest of, I think. Not because it was heroic. It wasn't. It was just quiet and repetitive, and sometimes very lonely. Showing up for my own life on the days when no one else was particularly interested in it. Making the drive. Wearing the green dress, sitting at the table by the side exit and eating the dinner because I was hungry and I had earned my place there, even if my name wasn't on the list. I wrote back to my mother, "That would be nice. Let me know dates." And I meant it, more or less, not because everything is fine, but because I am not the person who needs it to be resolved in order to keep going. I already know how to do that part on my own.